Is it time? Yeah, it's time. Welcome to the True Craft Podcast. I am your host, Chris Farman, and I'm joined by co-host, Katy Noel. This time around, we are all about one thing: killer conversations with close friends about the state of craft. Oh, it's going to be good. I hope to open the box on fresh topics while honoring the path that got us here. Let's do it. We are back for another episode of the True Craft Podcast. Today we have a special guest, not from the beer space, but from the spirits arena, the co-founder and distiller of Kings County Distillery up in Brooklyn, New York, Colin Spoelman. Welcome, Colin.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Katy, we've got to get some sort of cheering thing in the background.
Yeah. I'll put that a voiceover, like a crowd clapping.
Do it in post.
Yes. Yeah, we got to do some sort of thing. So, Colin, I always ask this question to the guests when they come on: how was the summer in New York? How was the summer? And everyone starts with a weather update. You can give us a weather update, but I'm really concerned about how was the spirits business in New York.
Yeah. Well, I think it's definitely a weird time. The pandemic has really shuffled everything. I think it lasted in New York longer than most places. And New York is so dependent on its bar and restaurant scene that took a little bit of a long time to get back to normal. We were sort of still checking vaccine cards, well into 2022. So yeah, it's just been a weird.
That's crazy. You were still checking vaccine cards into 2022.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So it's been like a weird just reorientation of the entire landscape. People don't go to the office as much as they used to. I think that's, if I had to name one thing that's kind of nailing a lot of our retailers that operate out of Midtown Manhattan, they used to get lunchtime crowd and they would close at 6 p.m. and do a ton of business. But those shoppers are not really present anymore. And so work from home is a real thing that is affecting New York City for sure. There's some cyclical. Whiskey doesn't sell a lot over the summer. So we've always kind of used that time to kind of retrench and figure out what we're doing for the fall.
That's interesting because I feel like craft beer probably is higher in the summer, but then
surges.
So it's like opposite seasonal type feel.
Right.
Interesting. What's the high season then?
Right before Christmas.
Okay.
Because most people are buying gift bottles ultimately.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. But even in beginning of September, like right now, we see a substantial pickup because it's like it's like pumpkin spice lattes and bourbon whiskey. Like those things may go even together. I don't know. I've never tried it, but there's a feeling once the fall weather starts to creep in, even if it doesn't, people are so excited for fall they tend to just jump into whiskey full throttle.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it seasonal wise, because I would say for the last couple of summers, summer is the biggest season for beer. And the last couple of summers, it was double IPAs, hazy IPAs, like the bigger beers, not boat beers, but kind of turned into boat beers. Flash forward to 2023, and it's crisp boat beers. It's all lagers, ambers.
Yeah, boat beers are.
Oh, a boat beer is like a light lager, like
yeah.
That like keep putting them down. Is that kind of the vibe?
Yeah, like a light lager, a low ABV beer. You can drink a couple, and you're not. You drink one or two of like these big West Coast IPAs, and you're gone. You're a gonzer.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
You're not.
Yeah, as a consumer of beer, I've gotten like when I want an IPA, I want a Sierra Nevada. I don't want anything that's pretending to be an IPA.
Sure.
So it's almost a little bit like you don't quite know what you're going to get with an IPA anyway, so you might as well go for the thing that is advertising itself as a like crisp lager, and that's like more it's more dependably what it claims to be. So that's I mean, I usually drink beer when I'm not drinking whiskey, which is more often recreationally.
Yeah. And talk to us about what you guys make at Kings County Distillery as far as the portfolio.
Yeah. So Kings County's been around for 13 years, and we have focused in some ways on like distilling cultures from around the world. Like we make bourbon and we make rye whiskey, which are American styles of whiskey, but we do so in a more European way, meaning we borrow sort of older technology, older processes. So in a way, we're making whiskeys that have more like a sort of international outlook is one way of thinking about it. But another way of thinking about it is just we use an older technology that really isn't used very much in American whiskey. And really, since Prohibition, the American whiskey industry got incredibly consolidated, such that by the mid 80s, there were only about 12 distilleries making American whiskey: Jim Beam, Jack Daniel, Maker's Mark. And there really weren't any small distillers. And it's been a little bit first on the West Coast. There were some little guys that popped up in the 80s, but really not until sort of full throttle after 2010, really. I mean, Kings County started right at the moment when a lot of these new distillers were opening. So really trying to bring just diversity back to American whiskey in a way that it really just hasn't had. And that mirrors a little bit what happened with the craft beer movement. And so in our case, it's less about focusing on obscure styles that we can kind of bring back to drinkers, but really just drilling down on what did bourbon actually used to be before it got sort of hijacked and taken somewhere else. So our core products are 3 different bourbons. We have a straight bourbon, a peated bourbon, which is a little bit of like a Scotchy bourbon, and then a blended bourbon, which is a little bit of a more mixable entry-level price point.
Very good.
Mixable, like you could make, like it'd be common to make mixed drinks.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Whereas I would say our like straight bourbon and peated bourbon are more like neat sippers.
Yeah.
I mean, you can drink it however you want. No, as long as you buy a bottle.
You're the expert, though.
I'm pretty thrilled. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. You and I talk a fair amount, and I never thought about like the resurgence of craft distilleries, bringing it back to where how it was made before in small batches, and probably in bathtubs and
right.
really small nondescript locations, and here we go, big business took it over, and then now you're trying to bring it back. That's an interesting perspective on how you do that. And how would you characterize the landscape of, is the majority of the bourbon still being made by the big guys, or like what percent does?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's some new like mini majors, or like this kind of new crowd of pretty substantial distillers that have opened in Kentucky, mostly Kentucky and Tennessee, that really do have some scale, like Bardstown Bourbon Company, Wilderness Trail, Castle and Key. And they end up doing not just their own production, but they also contract produce for a lot of brands, because just in the way that the beer world has a lot of, there's production breweries, and then there are brands, and sometimes, and then there's like genuine brewers who are making it in their facility. With whiskey, it's either you're drinking Maker's Mark, or you're drinking, for the most part, something that somebody has bought from a commercial distillery and is rebranded as their own thing. In terms of that, like true grain to glass spirit, there are a few big ones around the country, and in Texas you have like Garrison Brothers and Balcones, Woodinville in Seattle. In Portland you have House Spirits, which makes Westward. But that's more of an exception than and maybe accounts for 1 or 2% of all the bourbon sold in the United States. And so it's still, craft spirits are still very much in its infancy. And the big differentiation between beer and whiskey is just that whiskey ages for any number of years. So even if these distillers got started, as we did, more than 10 years ago, it may not really be that they have any quantity of product to be able to put on shelves because of that aging lag time. And 4 years is kind of the gold standard for American whiskey.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about this topic of regionalization that you brought up in our pre-talks on this before the show. Talk to me about what regionalization looks like in the spirit space, and I'll see if we can parallel that to beer and understand kind of what comes next of it.
Right. Well, I mean, I should just say I've really maybe understood better than I think a lot of distillers that craft whiskey should emulate craft beer for it to be most successful. And so looking at craft beer where you have seasonal releases, that's been a big part of what we have done with sort of like spiced whiskey in the winter and jalapeno grapefruit whiskey in the summer. But another piece of that is just for decades, you know, the region of American whiskey was Kentucky and Tennessee. And that was just because that's where the industry consolidated. But that's not to say that there isn't an argument for Texas whiskey. And when whiskey does pick up because of the way that it ages, a lot of its individuality from the way that it maybe less in the sense of like terroir and that sort of winemaking tradition, where there's just a certain kind of soil and a certain kind of climate. But the aging process really does create different approaches to whiskey making. And we just haven't had any tradition to incubate and then sort of entrench because it just got all obliterated after Prohibition. So a lot of the newer distillers, do you have a question?
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say a lot of the newer distillers are really looking for ways to band together with, you know, the sort of regional players to create more distinctive styles than just Kentucky bourbon and Tennessee whiskey, which is just Kentucky bourbon by a different name. And so one thing that we've done in New York is create Empire Rye. Rye whiskey is really sort of the history of distilling in New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland. And so to come together with New York distillers and say, we can only make Empire Rye in New York, that's going to be our thing, was a way for us to sort of carve out a little bit of a place that exists beyond Kentucky bourbon, because that's so much where the market has been for, you know, more than 100 years, really. So, and Texas is doing very much the same thing. I think you see on the West Coast a lot of brewers who have become distillers. So they're used to working with malted barley, and really are brewers first and distillers second, which creates a different sort of approach to whiskey making. And it's very exciting. And so I don't think many of the bigger strategic companies have picked up on this, but eventually, in the same way that Budweiser eventually was like, oh, we have to control every city in the country with a brewery there. I think that may also end up being true of spirits, but we're, you know, decades away from maybe that moment.
So that's interesting you mentioned that, and I want to bring up an event that happened this past summer. You recall, or you may not recall, that back in 2015, 2016, AB and Miller Coors and Constellation, they were on a buying tear, right? Buying spree. All right. And their idea was, we've got to fill our wholesale partners with craft options. Okay, so they purchased a bunch of breweries to give their wholesale partners options. Fast forward to 2023, Constellation just gave back Funky Buddha they sold the brewery back, right?
Yeah.
Anheuser-Busch sold back Appalachian State, and then they sold back like 8 brands to Tilray, which is this cannabis.
I think Blue Point was one of them, which is our local New York AB craft distiller, craft brewery. Yeah,
correct. And the thought there from all the brewing is that they thought they could take these what were regional brands nationwide and plug them into all this capacity all around the country, but they quickly realized that it's not going to work. It's not going to work, and it's not going to work at the scale that they want to. So they're just like, and I'm curious, like, what all these companies are going to do now. More specifically, Funky Buddha and Appalachian State, the Tilray brand. There's still some questions about who really owns Tilray.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the big money behind it? And are they really buying capacity just to have cannabis capacity, like Cannabev capacity,
Right.
or like what the deal is? But for the partners that actually took them back, right? What's the plan now? Like, how do you unravel from all these states that you got this dumpster fire you just got handed, right? Do you continue to distribute there? Do you continue, or do you consolidate back to your area, your region? So are we talking about the same thing here about
Well, where you're talking about sort of the de-evolution of that moment, but I don't think the fundamental strategy is kind of the same, which is just that if you want to be a great craft brewery or craft distillery, instead of thinking I want to make the best whiskey on earth or the best whiskey in America, maybe the thought is, let me make the best whiskey for my region, go really deep there, make sure that, you know, that I best that competition. And that will eventually be meaningful, whether or not that's a strategic company coming in, or whether it just means, you know, people come to over time recognize the importance that you are for that community. And, you know, whether or not that becomes a national portfolio of different pieces to a big strategic company, I don't know. I mean, I would just say the fundamental idea of having craft products from cities around the country, I think still is a pretty strong one. Whether AB was able to pull it off in the way that they wanted to or not may be a secondary question. But I think it's one that is already shaking out in whiskey, which is just that already Texas has a pretty established hierarchy of distillers. And in some way, they got there faster because of the climate in Texas just makes whiskey age faster. So people could have really full flavored whiskeys within, you know, 2-3 years. Whereas in New York, it might take us 3 to 6 years to get to the same level of maturity.
So I wanted to stop you earlier. Why Kentucky? Why is Kentucky the Bourbon Trail? Is there any?
That is a great question, and it started in, you know, in the 13 colonies. I mean, people were making whiskey after the Revolutionary War, really as a reaction to rum, which was really the first, you know, sort of alcoholic beverage of rum.
Rome? I was like, this is a history lesson.
Yeah. No, like the you know, very despicable moment in American history, but triangular trade of molasses, slaves, and rum was really the way the British exploited the American colonies. And after the Revolutionary War, America said, let's make whiskey because that's a domestically, you know, it's a domestic spirit. And it really was what people drank before refrigeration. And then it was not until the 1800s that beer started to take precedence. So but in terms of as America expanded from those 13 colonies and as that whiskey sort of tradition expanded, it got as far as Kentucky. And then sort of as Chicago opened up the West, Chicago actually outstripped Kentucky, but it did it more cheaply and with, you know, just sort of less investment in quality. And so people began to think of Kentucky all the way back in the 1870s and 1880s as the sort of craft, you know, versus the Chicago commercial. And so Kentucky held on to that reputation. And then after Prohibition, the Chicago distillers never reopened. And it was the Kentucky distillers that had the reputation to build on. And that's when, in the 70s, when whiskey crashed again, the remaining players were all pretty substantial corporate-owned Kentucky distillers.
Got it.
But even after Prohibition, there were a lot of urban distillers in Cincinnati and St. Louis and Pittsburgh. Those all closed with Prohibition too. So Prohibition really, as it did with everybody, scrambled the landscape, and only the very wealthy and the very rural were able to come out of Prohibition with any production capacity. And that tended to be rural Kentucky.
Got it. That's a great history lesson there. Let's talk about buying behaviors and customer purchasing behaviors between the two beverages. What are your thoughts on the profile of the spirit consumer versus the beer consumer?
Right. Well, the spirit consumer, you don't see beer guys walking into the bar and like looking over the menu and then saying like, what else do you have? Like, what do you have that's more expensive?
Yeah.
That's like in the back or whatever. But that's kind of the spirits consumer is wanting the most expensive thing, the most old thing, the rarest thing. So there is a little bit of a like aspect of whiskey culture that speaks to the person who is chasing a superlative, whether that's the oldest, the most expensive, the rarest.
Like a luxury kind of.
What's that?
Oh, I was saying like almost like a luxury kind of like element.
Yeah,
The prestige.
in a sort of in a conspicuous way. I mean, that's also a part of it, And so, whereas I think beer drinkers tend to be interested in variety, or theoretically interested in variety. The whiskey drinker isn't yet, although I think again, sort of, I do think the all of whiskey learns from beer eventually. And just to sort of place the craft distillery movement in a moment, I think we're at the moment when like Pete's Wicked Ale collapsed. And, so back like 93, I don't know when that was, but there was kind of a bubble in craft beer in the
99.
90s. Yeah, okay.
Yep.
And then I wouldn't be surprised if we're kind of in the same moment with craft spirits, because it has just been a like anybody can make money in craft spirits of any variety. So it's that moment where like the multiplicity of what's happening in spirits may have to sort of drill down into who actually has good stories, good products, etc.
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, I've always said this from day one, making spirits is not for the faint of heart. Beer isn't either, but the runway to profitability is 10x in spirits.
Yeah.
The runway to profitability is so much longer in spirits, and that just takes a patient person. That takes I mean, sure, you could buy your way to profitability very quickly, but that's going to take exponentially more capital. When it comes to that. And I don't think the consumer, do you think the consumer cares
well, I think the consumer does care. On the beer side, they care a lot less on the whiskey side.
Yes. Okay. I'm talking about on the spirit side.
Yeah. The idea of a corporate product that has a ton of money behind it does not seem to, bother anybody on the whiskey world, even though it does point them to what I would argue is inevitably a more generic, more mainstream, more uninteresting flavor profile. But again, if you get the more mainstream flavor profile that's like 15, 18 years old, you can say, I've got something really unique, even though there's nothing unique about the distillate. There's nothing unique about the barrel it was aged in. The only truly unique thing about it is that it just happened to be aged longer than all the sort of cheaper whiskeys that were distilled on the same day that just took a different path. So, I think we're still waiting for that moment when the indie movement within spirits gains some mainstream acceptance. And really does. I mean, there's in New York City, it's pretty rare for bars to serve anything other than craft beer, but it is also equally rare for them to serve anything other than mainstream whiskey.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of like, even within the bar program, there's a huge disconnect that I think at a farm to table restaurant, you go like, what are you doing with this like global Italian liqueur that can be purchased at any place on the globe?
It's ironic
that you think is making your drinks appear to be, sort of crafty, but in fact they are just very tediously, repetitively, sort of commercially unadventurous.
Sure.
What do you think the arc for change looks like for that? Or is it just a matter of waiting for consumers to get it?
I don't know. I've been wrong about this enough that I should probably bow out of predicting, because we've been in the game for 13 years, and I did expect it to come sooner than it has come. And so I think with spirits, it takes a lot longer for that kind of thing to happen, and it
kind
may
of
never
matches
happen.
aging. It kind of matches how spirits take
Yeah.
so long to age anyway. So does maybe the
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a big piece of it. And it may take Kings County having a 25-year-old whiskey for us to say that we finally met the moment, and so that's 15 years away.
Describe that moment. That is the describe the moment, and give us an example of a distillery, a craft distillery who's had the moment.
I don't think there are any craft distilleries that have really had the moment. Like I just don't. I think there are some that are more widely accepted, and generally on the West Coast, where craft is a more accepted alternative all around. I think the East Coast still holds weird grudges against novelty. But
I was gonna say weird mindsets, but weird grudges is good.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Silicon Valley is on the West Coast for a reason. I think people just happen to be more accepting of like creativity and entrepreneurship, and there's less of an old order to break down. So I would say places like Westland and the Texas distilleries, really the first craft distilleries were in the San Francisco Bay, where you have St. George, Charbet, even Anchor Steam. One of his side projects in the 90s was to build a distillery, Old Potrero, that has actually outlasted the beer. So it's an interesting trajectory, but that was like, the 90s were a long time ago.
Right.
And that whiskey still has not broken into mainstream at all. So it's interesting. I don't know. Maybe it will never get there, but I do think eventually people will actually reorient what they imagine. I think right now people in their minds think 12-year-old Kentucky bourbon is like the best thing that you could imagine.
Ever,
when
yeah.
In fact, 12-year-old Kentucky bourbon is often just pretty cheap distillate that's aged up to sell at a high price point. But it didn't begin life any different than the white label Jim Beam. It just happened to, again, it's aged longer, it's released at a higher proof, and those are the only differentiating real features. Whereas craft distillers are using organic ingredients and using pot stills and using open fermentation and all the stuff that kind of makes its way into the beer conversation, in terms of process and ingredients, and just so far doesn't really factor much into the landscape of whiskey conversation.
Sure. Getting close to the end here. What do you wish that the consumer cared about? What do you wish that spirit drinkers, spirit purchasers cared about?
Yeah, I mean, I wish they cared less about proof and age, which are the numbers that appear on the bottle. Like it's of course those are the things you fixate on because that's the shred of information the company has given you, and more focused on mechanism of production, ingredients, where do they get their grain from, what do they say is different about their product, if anything. I mean, in there's so much of a very boring world of old stories about grandpa so and so and this sort of prohibition legacy, that just it has no bearing on the product at hand. So I wish people got under the hood a little bit and were asking about the way that the spirits are made, and literally asking their distiller or brand owner what distinguishes this product. It's a funny question, because in beer you wouldn't go and sit in front of like 5 beers from a brewery and say, what differentiates you from any other brewery? Like, what are you talking about? This is our beer. It's different. It tastes different. That's what differentiates it. It's our beer, But with spirits, I get that question all the time. What differentiates your whiskey? It's like people are so used to whiskey that just all taste the same. So, I mean, it's a fair question, but I have a good answer to that question, and most brands I don't think do. And so I guess that's the question I wish people would ask more. Yeah.
What differentiates your brand? Yeah. I that would be That'd be good. I'm gonna start doing that when I visit distilleries. So when I visit like tasting rooms or tours or tastings, I'm gonna be like, what differentiates your bourbon, your rum, whatever.
Right. I mean, it's a good question for a brewer to be able to answer, right? I mean, it's a good question for anybody to be able to answer
Yeah,
because it's a fair question. If you're in business, you should have an answer to that question.
absolutely.
But I feel like it tastes different is a good answer that not every distillery can really say, or let's say brand, because I'm not really talking about distilleries. I'm talking more often about brands that source from the same sources that fuel most of the commercial bourbon and rye whiskey that's out there.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about that. I didn't know if we can go there or not. So what if I'm a distillery that sources 90% of my stuff from MGP or
right.
Is you that that's a
I mean, I've gotten a little, honestly, I've like had to like yield a little bit of my my like indie spirit here, I guess, just because like at a certain point you can't totally fight it. In the world of spirits, there are these sort of MGP is this kind of not very well known, but white label contract distiller that makes for a lot of the brands that are out there. And so, 8 times out of 10, if you buy a bottle of whiskey that has a different name than actual distiller that it comes from, MGP, or there's a few others that do this.
The base comes from there.
Right. Well,
the base.
I mean, but all of it, because there is nothing else other than the base, because you can't add anything to bourbon. It'd be one thing if you could say, here's our apricot bourbon, and we get the base from MGP, but this is how we change it. But most people, there's like people selling single barrels of, a new brand, but in that instance, they have literally done nothing to that barrel since it came from MGP. They're just selling you a single barrel of MGP that they can't even say we blended it to our own palate, because it just is,
I thought it was all like as soon as it hit in a clear form, and then the distillery put it in barrels, aged it, blended it, no.
98 times out of 100, they're buying the pre-finished whiskey. The only thing they might be doing is diluting it, putting the label on. There's diluting it with your local tap water.
Chris, which talking about this with Zach from Carbon 4, how brands are just like throwing their labels on like canning lines, for example.
Oh yeah, the contract, yeah, the co-packing model. Yeah, we mentioned that.
Yeah, that's so interesting because
I mean, all of the enthusiasm in craft beer came from, those guys like Fritz Maytag or I forget his name, from Sam Adams, but just like, we're going to hold the feet to the fire of the big brands and say, well, we have a flavor alternative. We have a process alternative.
Right.
This is the way beer used to be. And that was very inspiring for a lot of people in my generation. And so we're trying to do the same thing for spirits, but it's a totally different context, and it's weirdly a harder climb. And there's a lot of younger people who never knew anything about any of that, and they've come up in a world where there's big breweries and small breweries, and big wineries and small wineries, and big distilleries, and now small distilleries. So how that coexists going forward, and if people even drink alcohol going forward, is just such a wild, interesting, scary question.
So for all the listeners out there, do Colin and I a favor, and next time you visit a distillery, ask them what distinguishes your product. What makes your product unique? What makes your product different?
And ask them also where's their product distilled. I mean, do they make all their product is a good question, because again, a lot of times they don't, and that's just an important piece of information. It's not a judgment necessarily, but it tells you how much control they've had over the process and how much differentiation they could actually affect on the whiskey itself.
Yeah. Awesome. Anything else you want to add to this talk, or?
Nothing other than if people are interested, they should come visit us. We're easily
we were going to get to that.
Yeah, okay.
Tell the listeners where they can learn more about Kings County, even though I forgot in the intro to mention that you were on season 1, episode 2, And that we spent a lot more time in the previous True podcast talking about like the history of the establishment. Now we're going into the history of the person with this new launch. So season 1, episode 2 for a full background, but please tell us where we can learn more about, taste, see Kings County Distillery.
Right. KingsCountyDistillery.com. Obviously, we're on Instagram as Kings County Distillery, at Kings County Distillery. And then, but we make all our whiskey in Brooklyn, and not everybody who is a distiller in Brooklyn can say that. But we're easily located right off the Manhattan Bridge and very close to the Brooklyn Bridge, just right inside the over the East River from Manhattan. So it's a great location in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We have great tours, great tasting room from 1896 that looks like a little castle. It's just a great stop if you're interested at all in whiskey when you're in New York City. But we're also sold in about 30 states now. So unless you're a very severe control state, most likely Kings County will be, if not on the shelf, easily orderable. And that always does any brand a help when you walk into a store and ask for something that they don't have. So I would say that too. Even if you can't make it to New York, ask your local store if they have access to carry Kings County, and chances are they will.
It's my homework for the day.
Yeah.
You're gonna go do that, Katie? You're gonna go ask?
I'm tempted.
Yeah, we definitely have been shipping quite a bit to Oregon lately. So
it's actually all me. I admit it. All the Oregon shipments you sent out, they're all to me.
Right.
All the upcoming ones.
All good. I love it.
Awesome. Well, Colin, I appreciate it. You're always a wealth of knowledge when it comes to this, and look forward to having you on again to talk more about spirits and like the evolution of the industry and where things are going. I appreciate your time today.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. See ya.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the True Craft Podcast. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you are just dying to know what Chris and I look like, you can head over to YouTube for a video recording of the show. Links to cool information about our guests and other fun facts can be found in the show notes. This podcast is sponsored by Small Batch Standard, the premier financial agency built to serve the craft brewing industry. We help craft breweries grow profits through outsourced accounting, tax compliance, and growth consulting. Visit sbstandard.com today to learn more and request a discovery call.